Hi, everyone. Hi, it's so good to see you. Welcome back to session two. I love seeing your faces. Thank you to those of you who are able to put on your camera. I know not everyone's able to all the time, but it's really wonderful to be able to see each other and connect. I'm going to invite you, like we did last time, to just say hello in the chat. Let us know who you are and where you're joining us from. And I hope this will be an opportunity also for folks to connect with one another, which is kind of the theme of today's shiur. So last week we really focused on the central theme of the first chapter, which really was about what it means to train our hearts to turn toward each other precisely at the moment when we're most inclined to pull away from each other. This week, we're going to look at chapter two of the book and some of the sources that come from it. By the way, this is what the source sheet booklet looks like that some of you have. And otherwise, they're all online on Safaria. For chapter two, I actually created three different source sheets. And so there are a bunch of different opportunities here, but I picked one that I thought would be particularly rich for us in conversation today. But we broke them out because I realized they're really sort of three different ways of starting to look at and grapple with some of these questions. And I'm just going to reiterate, as I said to you last time, first of all, we do have some hard copies of the book available still, the booklet available still if people want them, but all of the source sheets are available and public on Safaria. So that you can find and access them there. Right now, I am going to put into the chat the link to the source sheet that's designed specifically for this shiur, for this conversation and learning that we're doing together, which is slightly different from what we have for the chapter two sources on Safaria, because I wanted to enhance a little bit for the sake of our conversation with one another. So you'll still have access to all the other ones, but this is one that I put together in a particular way for the sake of our conversation today. So hello, everyone, and welcome. It's good to be together. Let's jump right in. I am going to share, that's the link, and I'm going to share it with you here so we can start. Okay, so chapter two is called Please Hold On. And this shiur will be called Navigating Alone-ess. So I want to share with you that about 12 years ago, I read this book called Loneliness by Dr. John Cacioppo and William Patrick. Some of you have heard me speak at length about this book. A lot of the research that's in here is now pretty well known because our Surgeon General has been talking about, and there have been many more studies over the course of the last 12, 14 years. Surgeon General's been speaking a lot about it. I talk a lot about it. What the book opens, interestingly, with just this quote, which comes from somebody who reaches out to Dr. John Cacioppo and William Patrick as they start to they create a program where they're talking about loneliness. And she writes the following. She says, "I am 56 and have been divorced for years." Sorry, there's a typo there. "When I was still with my husband and told someone I was lonely, they responded with, 'But you're married.' I've learned the difference between being alone and being lonely. In a crowd, at work, even in a family setting, I always feel lonely. It can be overwhelming at times, like a physical sensation. My doctors have called it depression, but there is a difference. I read once, you are born alone and you die alone, but what about all the years in between? Can you really belong to someone? Can you ever resolve the inner feeling of being alone? Shopping won't do it. Eating won't do it. Random sex does not make it go away. If and when you find any answers, please write back and tell me," says this very desperate caller or writer. The reason I wanted to start with this because I think so many people can resonate to different pieces of this. First of all, the idea that loneliness is different from being alone, that loneliness doesn't really have anything to do with being single, that one could be single and live a very rich life and not suffer from loneliness. One could be married and suffer from extreme and acute and dangerous loneliness. That loneliness has a kind of physical sensation. that we feel loneliness sometimes in our throat, sometimes like a weight on our chest, that it's different from depression, right? So I wanted to start by just lifting this up because in the story of my study on this topic, it really began because I was hearing a lot of things like this from people in our extended community who were talking about just experiencing a deep sense of disconnect from other people, a kind of spiritual disconnect that often was not related to how social they were, and what kind of social environments they put themselves in. But it was a more of a kind of spiritual sense that they were not known in this world. That led me to some of this research. Um, Now we know, as you've probably heard me say many times over the last many years, that we now know that experiencing acute loneliness has the equivalent impact on our bodies of smoking 15 cigarettes a day, that it actually does real damage to our organs, to our lungs, to our hearts. We know that it brings on early onset illness. It's linked to dementia, to Alzheimer's, exacerbating what might already be what one might already be on the path toward those things because it causes inflammation inside the system. This research is really extraordinary, and it's led me to really think about um, how to speak about loneliness in public spaces, and in particular in Jewish spaces, and in faith-based spaces, and what our tradition has to offer us as a response to loneliness. So what I want to talk about today is how we navigate a sense, not the physical reality of being alone, but a sense of aloneness that we call loneliness. So I would like to begin by taking us on a little journey that starts at the beginning of the book of Genesis, and I'm going to bring us to our two creation stories. So I'll track it here on the text. I'll stop periodically so we can see each other's faces. And please raise your hand if you want to jump in with a question at any point. Is it legible on my screen? I can't tell if it's too big or can you see it? Okay.
Yep.
Okay, great. Okay, so first we have two different creation stories, as many are familiar with. There's one in the first chapter of Genesis, Bereshit, and there's one in the second chapter of Genesis. They tell two different narratives of how human beings were created. And from the tension between these two stories, the rabbis develop a whole theology about what it means to be human and what it means to be a human being living in relationship with other human beings. So let's just start up at the top with Genesis chapter 2. So this text says, Vayomer Hashem, Vayomer Adonai Elohim, Lo tov hayot adam levado, eselo ezer kenegdo. God said, it's not good for Adam, the person, to be alone. Eselo ezer kenegdo. I will make for him a what we call in English, it's translated often as a helpmate, but could also be translated as a fitting counterpart, as Safaria does here, or as someone to help him from opposite him. Okay, we'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment, but you might know the word neged. To neged means to oppose. To be neged something is to oppose something. Ezer is to help or support someone, to help him by opposing him. So first, there's some very strange elements here. Adam, the first person, is not male. Adam, as we know, and we'll see in just a moment, is a gender neutral being. And that's why I translate Adam as Adam, because it's referring to this very distinct being. It's not good for the Adam to be alone. I will make for him a counterpart. Now, if you look to chapter one's version of the creation story, it reads like this: Vayivra Elohim et Adam b'tzelmo, and God created the Adam in God's own image. B'tzelem Elohim bara'oto. In God's image, God created him. Zachar nekeva bara'otam. Male and female, God created them. So maybe you've encountered this challenge to the text before, but in this most basic and preliminary introduction of human beings to the world, there's a lot of complicated gendered language that is used here. God creates Adam, this individual creature, and that individual is both male and female, is both him and also them at the same time. So there, in the first case, in chapter 1, what we see is that Adam is both male and female. In the second case, in chapter 2, we see that Adam is created and is lonely and needs a counterpart. So that counterpart is then created as an Ezer Kenegdo. If you're confused, it's because it's confusing. So the rabbis are going to pick up on this and try to understand what's actually going on. And from the confusion, both within and between these two narratives, they will weave the following tale. I'm going to bring us down for a moment to the Tur Ha'aruch, which is text number 4 on this page. And do you know what? I'm going to try to get this to display like that so we can see it a little bit better. Okay, so by the way, if you are not so familiar with Sefaria, if you click into any one of these on the source, it will bring you to other commentaries or explanations of that source. It's really an incredible tool. So for you to do on your own later. Okay, so from the Tur HaAruch, it says the following. It's not good for the Adam to be alone. Okay. Now, clearly, it had not been God's intention already at the time that God created Adam, that he should remain single, seeing that all of the other creatures were created in pairs, male and female. So why would God create the human creature, unlike everyone else, as only one? When all of the other creatures of the world got to be created in pairs, even the trees and the herbs contain seed to enable them to mate and reproduce of their kind. However, says Tur HaAruch, however, it is possible to argue that Adam was created with two faces, and that between them, within a single body, they possessed everything that they would need in order to reproduce. So all of the other animals and all of the other species needed something else in order to reproduce. Human beings were different. We were the pinnacle of creation in this idea. The way that it worked was male and female. God created them together in one entity, and that they could have just reproduced. That individual being could have reproduced another individual being, and each one would be sort of self-sufficient in the process of reproducing themselves. But God saw that it would be better that they should stand independently, facing one another, so that they could see one another, having the choice then to separate from or to closely associate with one another in accordance with their wishes. Okay, so now imagine for a moment, you've probably seen this artistic image of the two-headed creature. And in the rabbinic imagination, they're facing apart from each other. There's the male side and the female side, and their backs are sewn together. And God saw that even though they could reproduce this way, they would be lonely for one another, and instead separated them out so that they could then turn and face one another, stand independently on their own, so that then they could choose each other. They could choose partnership, or they could choose distance from one another in accordance with their wishes. And according to this text, that is the meaning of E'eselo Ezer Kenegdo. I will make for him a helpmate, meaning that originally in chapter 1, Adam was created with male and female both inside. And then I will make for him a helpmate. God separated these two out so that they could then be the partner that the other one needed. So I want you to hold on to that image for a moment, because I think it's real. There's some really critical elements here. This idea that individuals need to stand independent from one another, and then from a position of independence, have the power, the capacity, the ability to choose each other. And that's what it means to be opposite each other, that they are able to help each other, not by being one, sort of woven together, but by being separate and apart from each other and able to choose to support one another. I'm going to put another idea on the table, and I'm going to put two more ideas on the table, and then we're going to discuss. So go back up now to text number 3 from Chizkuni. Chizkuni says, and you're going to hear an echo from the Torah Ruch, Chizkuni says it's not good for the Adam to be alone. This wasn't a new idea that God had. After Adam lived in that garden for the day, and then God said, "This isn't really working out." Lo tov heyot Adam levado. It's not a new idea that God had. God planned it all the time. Not wanting to impose a partner on Adam, God gave him a chance to first go out and name all of the animals, find out that all of the animals had partners, and create within Adam something that he would feel desire for, something that he would feel he lacked, because he would see that it's possible, and it would make him yearn for that kind of partnership. Now, why would God do that to Adam? Because then God could respond to the wish of Adam, a wish that Adam had not even yet voiced. If the mate was provided in response to Adam's longing, he would then appreciate the partnership even more. So there's a lot of kind of theological manipulation in this passage. There's also something very tender, which is that sometimes we don't even know what we want until we see that other people have something that we ourselves are lacking. And once we achieve or attain something that we really yearn for, we receive it differently. It feels different to us. I was once in a shiur many years ago in a Torah lesson with a wonderful teacher who said, "Why is it that every one of our matriarchs struggles with fertility? Why is it that Sarah and Rebecca and Rachel, they all struggle with infertility, that Hannah?" And it's immediately I understood, and perhaps it was just the stage of life that I was in at that time, struggling with my own fertility, that in the yearning for something, if you do actually attain it, it was something you will never take for granted, right? It's different. And I think that Chizkuni is tapping into, there's a kind of raw human desire or need that once you have that need, you will not take for granted once you're able to achieve it. I'm going to just add one more piece to this puzzle for us to consider. Go down now to number 5. This is Sforno on the 2nd chapter of Genesis. Sforno says that what's meant by an ezer kenegdo is the following. He says this is a helpmate who will be an equal, also reflecting the divine image and the form. So it's not that Adam is superior and Eve is his helpmate there just to help him, but to truly be an ezer kenegdo means that you are equal to your partner, and that as much holiness as is in your partner is also in you, and vice versa. He says this is vital so that a person can identify what they need and get their needs met. The reason the Torah adds the word kenegdo is that whenever someone confronts someone of equal power, moral, and ethical weight, such a confrontation is termed neged. The playing field is even. It's really a different idea of what partnership looks like than what might be culturally normative. So I'm gonna stop the share for a moment, that you can certainly continue to look on your own. And I want to ask how this is landing for you. First, the tension between two different creation narratives. One that suggests that Adam Harishon, the first person, is created both male and female internally, which is confusing, even in the way that the pronouns are used in the text, but also could be very affirming. The second, an idea that Adam is created first and then Eve is created afterwards, to, in some way, as many thousands of years of tradition have read it, to serve and to help and be subservient to Adam, which is not the way that our rabbis are choosing to read it here. And then the idea that actually the way that the rabbis reconcile this is that they were created at the same time, but needed to be separated from one another so that they could choose each other. Because in choosing someone to be your partner. And this does not mean your romantic partner or your marriage partner, but your partner, meaning someone you can trust, someone you can see as a true equal, someone who sees the divine in you as much as you see it in them. That is precisely the function of the Ezer Kenegdo in order to teach and build within us a yearning for that kind of partnership, because that kind of partnership, our tradition seems to be saying, is absolutely fundamental to what it means to be a human being. I'm curious to hear how this lands and what it raises for you. What kinds of questions does that raise for you before we go on to the next piece? Hi, Wendy.
One of the things that's this part of Torah is always fascinating to me. And one of the things that's always intrigued me is that it that God makes human beings in our image. God says, let's make the human being in our image. There are multifaceted aspects of God, or there are many gods, or there's more than one. So I started thinking about this, and maybe, and especially with what you're talking about, that each person has within them is multifaceted, just as each one of us has so many different aspects of ourselves. And that because we have so much, part of being on this earth, that interaction, that necessity in life to procreate with another person, we're asked also maybe to procreate our growth as human beings. And when we have another that we're facing is not, it can be also, it can not only be a reflection of us, but also something there to learn from and to help us navigate life and make it much, in God's image that we create, that we have the ability to continue to create this world with these various aspects within each one of us.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you. And I see that Rena wrote a mirror, and I think that's right, that what the tradition is setting up for us is that sometimes we need to have a kind of mirror to reflect back to us, even where the divinity is in ourselves. And if we're able to see that in someone else, what does it awaken? What does it open up? What kind of potential does it open up in us? I'm going to really quickly go to Kate and Matt, and then we're going to keep going. Kate and Matt?
Just what suddenly occurred to me is that God's creation in Genesis 1 is speaking, and speaking for us is to someone. So there is, even in that part, there's that interaction, whether it's the council or not. God speaks to the world. That Sorry, our dogs are now barking at someone, so I'll finish. That's it.
Thank you. Right. So that even intrinsic to this act of creation is the idea that God spoke and someone heard, someone received. And so in the tradition, it's the role of the ministering angels when God says, let us create them in our own image. So there's this idea that life is lived dialogically, that we are called to be in relationship. And again, I'm just going to repeat this. That doesn't mean that we're called to be married. That doesn't mean that we're called to have a romantic partner. If you happen to find that mirroring to you of your own divinity, of the God image inside of you comes from the person who also is your spouse, that's great. But like this woman wrote in her letter to John Cacioppo, didn't happen for her. And it doesn't happen for a lot of people. And I think part of the reason why married people are often so lonely is because when you expect to find that in your partner and your partner fails to deliver that for you, it could feel worse than not having a partner, right? Being in a partnership with someone who doesn't see you as an equal or who doesn't help reflect back to you the goodness inside of you or the divinity inside of you could actually make you feel more lonely than if you did not have a partner. So when I speak, I'm speaking here very expansively about what partnership means. It could be a rabbi. It could be a dear friend. It could be a sister. It could be it could be a relationship between a teacher and a student or a mentor, somebody who is able to see you and who you can see. That could be your ezer kenegdo. Now, I'm going to go on for a moment because I want to add another piece to this puzzle here that I think is really important. So going back to the text, I want to share with you this piece of Gemara. This comes from Masechet Avodah Zarah, which is a tractate that ostensibly is dealing with idol worship. There's all kinds of richness in this tractate. So look at the following midrash that some of you have heard me share this before. I spoke about it in my conversation with Dr. Murthy when he came to IKAR on Yom Kippur, which, by the way, if you didn't hear the conversation, we'll share it. You can get it online, but was really beautiful because he wrote a gorgeous book called Together, um, the 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 power of healing in a sometimes disconnected world, something like that. And we think about all very similar. We're asking very similar questions. He is the surgeon, or was the Surgeon General, and is really looking at it. His way in is a medical standpoint, but he actually is a very spiritual person. And my way in is from a spiritual standpoint, but I'm very interested in the science here as well. Okay, so look at this midrash. The sages taught on the day that Adam, the first person, was created, so the sixth day of creation, when the sun began to set upon him, he said, "Woe is me, since because I have sinned, the world is becoming dark around me, and the world will return to the primordial state of chaos and disorder, tohu vavohu. This must be the death that was sentenced upon me from heaven." I just want to pause there for a moment because because I believe this is the rabbis now imagining what happened. Think of the rabbinic imagination on the sixth day of creation when Adam is born in the morning, maybe male and female attached. The zipper comes down, they separate out, they find each other. This is the very first day of their creation. They spend the whole day out in the garden. They're experiencing the beauty and the innocence of that place. And then the sun starts to set. And for them, this is the first time in their lives that they've ever experienced darkness because it's the first day of their lives. And Adam does what I think many of us do when we experience the darkness. I think it's what a lot of us are doing now when we experience the darkness of the world. He immediately, look what he does. Woe is me. It's because I sinned. He starts to blame himself and say, what did I do? I must have done something wrong. And think about when we are experiencing profound loss or trauma, the way that we often blame ourselves. And the second thing that he does is he totally catastrophizes. His immediate reaction is the world is going to return to tohu vavohu. Remember, tohu vavohu was the state that the world was in the beginning, Bereshit, when we first started. Before the waters were separated, before there was light and darkness separated, before the landmass, the world was in a state of tohu vavohu. Now it gets dark for the first time, and immediately his assumption is that the whole world is going to return to tohu vavohu, and he believes that this comes from God, which means there's nothing that I can do to stop this darkness. So he is blaming himself, he's catastrophizing, and he's rendering himself powerless, right? Because he's assuming that God made this thing happen. I want to pull those out of the text here because I do believe that we do those same things, maybe in a different combination, maybe in a different order, in some way blaming ourselves and asserting our powerlessness are at odds with each other, because if we're blaming ourselves, we're still asserting that we have some power. If we could make something terrible happen, maybe we could also make something good happen. But I think that what Adam Harishon does is is resonant to what we do. So if we go on, what does he do? He does what Jews would come to do in times of great distress. It says, "V'haya yoshev b'ta'anit ubocheh kol halayla." He sits down and he fasts and he cries all night long. He sits down, he fasts, and he cries. V'chava boche kenegdo. And then Eve comes, and what does she do? She just cries kenegdo. Do you see this last word of the of that line, of that second line? V'chava boche kenegdo, the same word that is used in the Torah text up above when it says ve'aselo ezer kenegdo, that I will make for him someone to help him by sitting across from him. And now we have a midrash that tells us what it means to help someone by sitting across from you. And one of the things that it means is somebody to weep with you. She sits down across from her partner who's in great distress and she cries with him. Okay, so what does she not do? Think about what Eve does not do. She does not tell him, get up, wipe away your tears. It's going to be okay. She doesn't try to distract him from his pain. She doesn't ignore him and say, like, you're out of control right now. I'm going to come back tomorrow morning. And she doesn't promise him that it's going to be okay. She just sits down with him and cries with him. Boche kenegdo. She cries down. Bocha kenegdo. She cries right across from him. And that happens for many hours because it says that then the dawn eventually breaks. And it's only when the dawn breaks that he says, Minago shalolam. This must be the way of the world. So it's not like her presence with him, and I mean not just her physical presence, but her spiritual presence by his side across from him. It's not like it comforted him after an hour. She was there for many, many hours. And ultimately, only when the dawn breaks does he realize, oh, I think that this must be the way of the world, that there will be periods of light and there will be periods of darkness. And the darkness will be scary and it will be long and it will be deep, but it will end. It will end. And so, what is the question that we ask through those periods of deep darkness? The question we ask is, how do I survive the darkness? And the answer that the tradition gives is we have somebody who we let sit across from us and cry with us. We invite somebody into the most intimate spaces who's able to join us in our heartache. And that gives us the strength to survive until the new light comes. Now, once that happens, Adam gets up and he sacrifices a bull, and he offers his gratitude to God, recognizing now that this is the way of the world. I think it's interesting for us to ask what he's actually grateful for in this moment. Is he grateful for the sun coming back up? Is he grateful for the partnership of equals that let somebody into his most private moment of despair? Um, what does it mean to experience those moments of darkness and not have somebody who can come and sit across from you and weep with you? And what does that do to the soul? There's, if you look down in text 8, I brought this line from Psalm 23, which we read at funerals. Gam ki elach begates al mavet, lo irara ki ata imadi, shivtecha mishantecha, hema yenachamuni. From the depths of our grief, we say, even though I am walking through the deepest darkness, through the valley of the shadow of death, lo irara, why am I not afraid? Ki ata imadi. Because even here, I'm not alone. And what this does to us is it actually says to us that sometimes there isn't another person who's going to come and weep with you. And God then can be your companion through this darkest chapter, right? So, what I want to ask you now to think about is when you've been in that Gates Almavet, when you've been in that valley of the shadow, what or who helped you emerge from that place? What or who came and wept by your side in order to communicate to you that the darkness is utterly terrifying, you're right, and we'll navigate this time together. I know that this is the most human experience. And I want us to think together about the power of that presence. In Kohelet, it says, two are better than one because they have a good reward for their labor. If they fall, one of them can lift the other one up. But woe unto a person that is alone when they fall and doesn't have someone else to help them up. I'm just thinking back to this lonely person who writes to John Cacioppo and says, I've been married, I've been single, I've been at work, I've been home alone. I feel this deep sense of loneliness because I feel that when I fall, there's nobody here to help lift me. What she's saying is, I need to know that there's somebody who will be with me when I go through that dark night of the soul, not because they can eradicate the darkness, but because their presence there is precisely what will help me survive the darkness. I'm going to pause again for a moment and see if there are any thoughts that folks have, and we can share before we go on to
Rabbi,
the third piece. Yeah.
one thing, at night, we often have night terrors. Like at night, your mind can ruminate. And, you can take the smallest thing and, it can keep you awake from ever and self-doubt and fear and loneliness. And then the sun comes up and it all goes away. So it's sort of maybe how Adam was, fearful and alone at night, and then the sun rose. It just made me think of that.
Yeah, and I can't help but think about some of the Chatufim, of the hostages that are coming back now. And we're learning that they were held in total isolation for 450 days, to just not have another human being. Even when people weren't allowed to communicate with each other, they could look at each other, right? And what it means to be in that kind of darkness, what that does to the soul, to feel that you're that alone in that depth of darkness, and to not have that morning that comes up and makes you feel like, okay, I see a new sense of possibility here. Sarah, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, I didn't know if it really related, but one of the things I thought about is, well, like most human beings, I want to know the story, right? I want to get the story. So sometimes when something bad has happened, what the first thing we'll go to is what happened, right? And wanting to get the story. And
Yes.
we've just
Yes.
been, are as a community, and we've gone through this tremendous trauma of these fires. And I was really lucky that somehow I realized that was the last thing I should do, right? The last thing was, and how did you escape? And all the kind of questions, or worse yet, talk about something I happened to me, right? But realizing that it was just no one wanted, that it was just to be there, just to
Mhm.
be there for people, and gradually, as in the book, we do find the words, right? But you wait. At first, the best thing is no words, but simply being present.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I want to share, I was with some folks yesterday in Shiva last night, and they were talking about now they held some Shiva here. Now they're flying back to their home. They're gonna hold some Shiva where they are. And they were talking about this practice of putting rules on the door for Shiva, which is something that some of you have seen in our community. We've done a number of times, where, especially after a particularly traumatic loss, where we have not left it to chance that people who come into the Shiva house are going to know exactly what the person needs and how to handle it. And so I've invited people to write what would be helpful for them and what would not be helpful for them. And this was actually something that I really learned from Jessie Zilberstein in our community, who, after her son Giddy's death, she wrote down some rules for people and shared it with them. And then Gail and Colin, you just Sarah referred to Colin's book again. Colin and Gail did it at their house as well. And there was recently another terrible tragedy in the community, and the family put rules on the door. And one of the rules was, please ask us about our son. Please do not ask us the details of how he died. And it felt so brave to me to see that articulated so clearly, because you're right, Sarah. I mean, what the comforter needs to get is not necessarily what the bereaved needs from the comforter, right? So there's this sense of, I need my questions answered. I need to know. I need to envision it. I need to understand. And often that is incredibly painful and only does more harm to the person who's already brokenhearted. And what Eve does here, what Chava does that's so powerful, is she just sits and weeps with him. She just cries with him and lets him guide her in sharing what he wants to share about how his fear, how he's holding his fear in this moment. So thank you for sharing that, Sarah. Kate, I see that you have your hand, and then Anne and Allie, and then I'll go back into the text.
Hi,
Hi,
Rob.
Rabbi. Thank you. I just have three quick thoughts.
Matt, can you turn off your volume so we can hear Kate?
Yeah, Kate's fine. I'm making it up.
One was that having been in New York City on 9/11, was that the day after, every restaurant, every bar, Central Park, we had smoke, from the bottom of the city, but everyone wanted to be with other people. And that was the start of communal tables at restaurants, where if you were single or you went to have a meal alone, you didn't have to be alone, and somehow that was acknowledged and created through eating spaces at the time. The other thing that this reminds me of is I used to do cultural diversity training around the country and around the world for the Anti-Defamation League. And we would say, it's not the golden rule, it's the silver rule. It's do unto others as they would want done unto them. It isn't doing unto others as we would want. I don't know necessarily what someone else wants, and certainly in the case of the mourner. And the third quick piece is what you brought to prostrating with at time of Alenu, which I have been doing for decades at B'nai Jeshurun. But at IKAR, you ask everyone to help everyone up so that when we do rise, it's together. And that, that little twist on something that was so meaningful to me expanded beyond comprehension. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I did realize, and for those who haven't been with us for High Holy Days, I hope you'll join us one day. But Alenu is very powerful moment for the community. And I realized that as hard as it is to prostrate fully to the ground and just submit to the fact that we cannot control the world, it's equally challenging, or even more so, once we recognize that we can't control everything, to then find the strength to still continue to persevere. And so we have to get up. And the act of getting up after prostrating is also a very powerful spiritual act. And there are people in our midst who both physically and spiritually cannot get up without each other. And so what does it mean to help each other rise in that moment? And it's been really powerful for our community. Okay, thank you for saying that. Anne and Allie, I'm going to go to you quickly, and then we'll come back to one more piece from the text.
Keep thinking about the issue of we were made, man was made, woman, we were made from each other, so we're really one. And you
don't have it there.
We were supposed to comfort each other by not offering solutions, but by reflecting each other. So the other or the partner is a mirror. Meaning that when you think of these hostages alone, we are one. The other partner is there with us. And I just wonder if that's the whole point, is that the reason that we were given the partner is to realize it was all inside us.
That's really beautiful, Anne. Thank
I
you.
don't know if I'm explaining that correct, but I just wonder if that's what the scriptures are meant to remind us, that we forget the partner was made from us. It's us.
Right. I think that that's very powerful, and we have the capacity even internally to imagine one another, even when we can't, even when the other can't be right there by our side,
Right.
grieving with us. We can imagine their presence with us, and that too can be a source of strength. And grieving alone is very difficult, and you can't say when if you say Yitkadav Yikadash Shemei Rabbah in your house alone, there is no one to say Amen, and there's nothing that can replace the power of someone seeing and affirming that you are in pain in this moment. And so I think that part of what our tradition is pointing us toward is that we're not meant to do it alone. I think in the most extreme circumstances, we might have to figure out how to find that kind of comfort and support internally. And in most cases in our lives, we don't need to, because we actually can build that kind of relationship with one another. I'm just going to pull one thing before I go to Allie from
But
both.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
just not to interrupt, but I had an interesting thought the last time I was at IKAR, surrounded by all these people last Shabbos, that here I am together, but alone. And that is the beauty that that.
Yeah. Thank you. And I think we also play with that dynamic and tension in the davening, that we're all in the room together, but each of us having our individual experiences. And there's something very powerful in that. Jonathan, I want to lift up something that you said in the chat, that Eve could have focused on the darkness, but instead she focused on Adam. There's something so powerful about that. And I'm grateful to you for putting that in here. She must have also been scared. And she was able to see what her partner needed in that moment, even in that moment of her own fear. It goes to the question that somebody was asking last week about, what do we do when we're all walking to the left? Eve is also experiencing the darkness. And she's able to say right now, he's in the more acute pain. And so I'm going to go sit by him right now. I'm just going to sit by his side and see what what kind of comfort that might bring to him. Just open my heart in a very human way with another person. Ali Geller. And then we are going to go back to the text for our last couple of minutes.
I'll go really fast, but I just want to thank you for saying what you said about stories, because I work with people who've had traumatic loss. And one of the most important things I've learned is that we must ask, tell us about this person, because ultimately that is so comforting. And that's what people want in a world that's become so dark for them. And often what happens when we ask them, they tell us the story, and then there are a lot of tears. And I just want to say, like, I've learned not to be afraid of that, and not to be afraid of the fact that I can't fix it, but just to hear the stories and to sit with them and to keep their person here. So I just want to elevate that, and thank you for saying what you said.
Ali, it's so powerful. And again, I mean, this goes back to Colin's book once again. He shares a story in there about the most awful moment of his life, the night of the crash, and that there was an incredible act of kindness visited upon him when one of the doctors in the ER, immediately after they determined that Ruby and Hart had died, brought the parents into a room and said, "Tell me about your kids. Who were they?" And he said that act of kindness, just her willingness to be so present to his raw grief, because Ali, you know, and I know, and others here know as well. I mean, it's so destabilizing to be that close to another person's pain. And it's so essential that we not run away from the pain. And what that doctor did was essentially modeled that if there was to be a path toward comfort and consolation and solace, that path would come through other people being willing to be present to the grief and cry together with them throughout the night. It's really powerful. I'm going to bring us back to the text for one more idea. But one of the things that I want to point us to here is that there are, as many of you know, I have these spiritual practices at the end of each chapter. And we created also spiritual practices for each of the source sheets. When we break it, there are questions to consider in the source sheets, but then also an invitation to practice. And so what I want to do is also invite you to think about what it would mean to start to practice some of these things, like actually calling up a friend who's experienced a loss and saying, will you share a little bit about how you're thinking about your dad these days? Are there any memories that are coming up for you? And what it means to embody Chava, who's not an afterthought to Adam. Eve is not an afterthought. Eve was the first thought, right? It says, multiple commentators say God knew from the outset that we would need Eve, and who's also not there to be subservient to Adam, who's there to support him by being an equal to him, who was willing to be at the same level, to see him eye to eye. And that presence, her ability to be so spiritually attuned to him, is precisely why he needed her in the world. What would it mean for us to try to embody that with one another? Both the willingness to be seen, which I think Adam was so out of control that day. He was so out of control with fear that he couldn't stop himself from being vulnerable with her. But often we do, right? Like we hold in the tears because we don't want to lose it. But also, so to be willing to show how brokenhearted we are, and then to be willing to step toward one another's brokenness and actually just sit together and weep. So the last thing I'm going to show you very quickly as we're about to close is something about Moshe. So you might know that the only other time in the Torah that something is lo tov. So throughout the first 5 days of creation, everything is good. God looks back and says tov, and even human beings are tov me'od on the 6th day. And then it's only when God notices how not okay it is for Adam to be alone that it says lo tov heyot Adam levado. As we've reviewed earlier, it's not good for a person to be alone. So the only other time that it says that something is lo tov is here in Exodus chapter 18. The context is really interesting. So chapter 18, we just read this in Parshat Yitro a couple weeks ago. Moses is sitting and he's judging among the people, and the people are standing about Moses from morning until evening. But then Yitro, his father-in-law, sees how much he's doing for the people. And he says, Ma hadavar hazeh asher ata useh la'am. Madua ata yoshev levadecha. Why are you doing this to the people? To the people. Why are you acting alone? And he says, it's because the people come to me and they ask questions and I'm making a decision. And then look what Yitro says in verse 17. He says, Vayomer choten Moshe elav, lo tov hadavar. Sorry, just lost my place for a second. He says, Lo tov hadavar asher ata oseh. It's not good, the thing that you're doing. It's not good what you're doing, he says. Surely you're going to get worn out and you're going to wear out the people too. And the reason I want to bring this is because I often think that when we're in the position of Moshe or the position of Adam and our hearts are hurting and we are like, we feel like it's on us, the weight is on me, and I can't share it with somebody else because I can't bring them into the depths of this darkness, that not only harms us because it's denying us the ability to have like real partnership and support in this moment, but it's actually harming the collective. That none of us is intended to do this alone. That actually is, I think I think Sforno like speaks to this in a much more direct way, but that none of us can do this alone. And I don't know what the conditions of the life were for the person who writes to John Cacioppo and says, I'm just like nobody's breaking through with me. It is a loneliness that is so profound. I can feel it in my body. And she's right to feel it because there is something physical that's happening to her in addition to something spiritual. I don't know what the conditions of her life are, but I know that often when we have, when we start to feel that depth of sadness and grief and overwhelm, it does for us the opposite of what it needs to do. And this is something that this guy writes about. It's something that Dr. Murthy writes about, which is if you think about hand on a stove pain, when you put your hand on the stove, you immediately, your hand is sending signals to your brain saying there's danger there. And so you pull your hand away and it gets you safe. The pain alerts your brain that you need something different in order to stay safe. But with loneliness, exactly the opposite happens. When you feel the pain of loneliness and the anguish, it tells you to pull away exactly when you need to step forward. Exactly when what you need is to open the door when Eve knocks on the door and says, I'm here to cry with you. Your instinct is to pull away from the pain, and that only makes the pain more pronounced. But what we actually have to do is find ourselves in relationship and in conversation with each other. And that's what it means to be dialogical beings from the beginning, not that we are called to find our husband or our wife and and build this like old school model of what a happy family looks like. It means to be willing to open our hearts to another person who can cry with us through the dark of night, and then will be there also to celebrate with us in the joy of a new day. And it's my deepest hope and prayer that in some way, this is the work of community, that we are doing this for and with one another. When we turn to one another tenderly, when we make ourselves vulnerable with one another, and we share that we're not at all okay when we're not okay. And that we receive that not by trying to say it's going to be all right, because it's not at all right, folks. But we are able to see one another. And that in its own right can be a great source of solace and a great source of strength. We're going to close for today. I would love to hear your thoughts. Feel free to email me anytime. And I'm going to look at the chat fully afterwards and see all the things that I missed. I also am going to put out next week, I'm going to put out a little questionnaire and see if folks want to continue, because we only have 4 sessions on the calendar, but I'm happy to continue for another 4 weeks if we'd like, so we can do 1 week for each chapter or even more. So start to think about if this is something that you'd like to continue. I'm absolutely thrilled and honored to have this time with all of you. So thank you so much. My blessings to you.